Isn't it true that some people are born into this world? You could be born into some criminal situation. You could be in some war-torn country and you're 8 years old and someone hands you a gun and says you got to kill people or something, and isn't that going to have a difficult impact? Because that's not just something that, you were deprived of something, but that these are things you actually committed yourself, or if you were born in a situation where you're stealing, you're part of some little group that's on the street and you're stealing. And so you're introduced into that, lying to people, from an early age or whatever. Doesn't that corrode you? Isn't that unfair that you would be stuck in that situation before you were old enough to have a choice? What about that? Well, a very intriguing answer to this comes from, of all places, an Old Testament law about an ox. This is Exodus 21:28. If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, then the ox shall surely be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be acquitted. And from context there, it talks about the fact that this particular animal had never displayed this behavior before. All of a sudden, out of the blue, it just stabs somebody and they die. Then it's important to put that animal to death and not eat its flesh. What a weird little typical Old Testament little detail to throw in there. What does that mean? But that its owner will be acquitted, meaning the owner is not responsible. The owner is not to be held to be at fault because of that circumstance. So what does this have to do with what we're talking about here? We're not talking about animals, are we? Well, Swedenborg says that the Old Testament, all of these kind of things in Scripture are actually about one person. Like we have an ox. There's an owner in us and there's an ox in us. Weirdly, it's almost similar to the idea that you have eyes that see, but your tongue can also see. Like the ox is a separate part, but it all feeds into the same thing. Your ox is your outer self. So we all have heredity. Swedenborg says that we have hereditary evil. We just got it from our parents and our ancestors and whatever, and it's just in there. And we don't even know. And sometimes, I don't know if you found this, but you go through your life and all of a sudden, some issue gets triggered and you're doing something you didn't even expect to be doing. Your outer self is just doing something because you got triggered and there was a latent, tendency in yourself that you never even realized was there. And all of a sudden, this thing is coming out of your outer self. Well, what Swedenborg is saying is that the owner is our inner self. The owner is not responsible for that. If the ox never showed that behavior before, if your outer self never did that kind of thing before, you're not responsible for it. You still have to take responsibility and deal with that. And the interesting detail about not eating the flesh of that animal spiritually means that we are not to identify with that. Don't think, I am this kind of person. Look at what my outer self did. No, don't eat that. Don't eat it. Don't eat it. It's bad. Don't make that, don't internalize that and decide that who you are, because there is a goodness region within us that's not affected by that. We still have the ability to tell right from wrong and so on. Doesn't matter what happened to us. If you're, 8 years old and someone hands you a gun, well, those circumstances are taken into account in the spiritual perspective on us that the other world has. They can see all that. They know it's all part of our file. Swedenborg even says that they can see that visually represented around us. So they can tell, these were the circumstances in which these acts were committed. And this is absolutely crucial. Here's another quote from that translation, Love in Marriage. This is section 530. And it's been talking about bad things that we've done. Namely, those things are not viewed according to the things done as they appear outwardly before people. In fact, not as they appear before a judge, but as they appear inwardly before the Lord and by him before angels. That is, according to what kind of desire and understanding the person put into them. This is not information that's readily available from this external perspective, but from the spiritual world, this kind of thing can be seen. In the world, Swedenborg points out, there are different circumstances that soften and excuse crimes, and also that make them more serious and more blameworthy. In other words, one thing would be, oh, well, this and that had just happened, or you're tired and you fell asleep or something, as opposed to, no, it was a really malicious act and you meditated it for 10 years before you did it. Those things affect, even in this world, those things affect the punishment for a crime. He goes on, and yet accusations after death are not made according to the outward circumstances of the act, but according to inner mental circumstances. So imputations after death. Now, wait a second. What are imputations? Well, that's from a Latin root. I won't, trigger Curtis's issues, but imputations have to do with what you are held accountable for. What is attributable to you? Is this really a trait in you, or is this something that someone else imposed on you from the outside? Imputations after death are made in keeping with what each one's intention and understanding are like. For the acts, what a merciful statement, go to the grave with the body, but the mind rises again. It's a very merciful and beautiful teaching. Swedenborg also explains that things are viewed in the light of our inherited evil. This is part of what the ox is. The ox just has a certain animal nature, and all of a sudden doesn't like the look of somebody, and they get gored. That's taken into account. Was it the ox in us? Was it the owner? Did the owner know about this or not? All these circumstances are taken into account. We all have inherited evil. It comes rolling down through the generations, and some of that stuff is in there. You don't know what's in there. But that is taken into account. That's all known. And in addition, if we are so unfortunate as to suffer from an impaired rationality, this is another circumstance that Swedenborg explains is totally taken into account. Now, what does impaired rationality mean? Well, it might just be someone who, gets drunk or is, taking medication or something like that. So it could be a momentary thing. It could be that the brain didn't develop, deprived of oxygen at birth or whatever, and, all kinds of different things in between. It can even be a function of the sort of mindset, the kind of concepts that have been drilled into us through our lives and how we've been affected by that. All this is known and all this is taken into account. So it really is a merciful view.